Hi everyone. This is Robin Han, and I'm the host of today's seminar. And we are very happy to have Professor Marshall Van Alstyne here today to share his latest research with us. Professor Marshall is, well-known researcher from the Boston University, and he's an expert in platform economics, innovation, and network effects. He has published widely in top academic journals such as Management Science, MISQ, and also he's a co-author of an influential and popular book called The Platform Revolution, which gets media attention from all those top media. And without further ado, maybe the floor is, I should give the floor to Professor Marshall Van Alstyne here. And if you have questions, you can use that reaction feature on Zoom, or just unmute yourself. And Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. What I want to address is a set of questions that we've been starting to confront partly as a result of the rise of artificial intelligence and generative AI. It's really a retake on one of an old questions by Ronald Coase. What do you do in the context of externalities? In his case, it was negative externalities and pollution costs. And here we've got shared information as others are building on the information that you might have, or you might build on their information. And how do we do that? What would the best intellectual property regimes be? And I'm going to present this in the style of kind of his original research using kind of law and economics approach. I want to visit not just the economics questions, but also the legal questions and how he would frame those to see if we could actually get some better answers. I'm also delighted to take questions along the way. So if there are particular portions that seem unclear, or if there are other things that you'd like to explore, by all means, just jump in the chat or jump in and raising a hand. We'll see if we can actually pause and do that. I'll also see if I can leave a little bit of time at the end for raising a couple of questions to see if that works. So what are the questions we want to go after? Let's see if there we go. The first of these is, can fairness be rational based on self-interest alone in a one-time encounter? So I want to see if, is fairness one of the better ways to manage intellectual property? If so, what would that look like? How would we manage that? The second is, consider the regimes that we have currently. We typically have either a property rights regime or an open source regime. As you know, in the property regime, you have the rights to actually control who can access it. And under the open source regime, you put it out there almost in the public domain so that anyone can build on it. These questions are motivated, but it's exactly what's been happening in the last 2 years. So when OpenAI released its ChatGPT, literally only about 2.5 years ago, an extraordinary flourishing of usage took place. And we've now seen extraordinary adoption rates. I think we've gone to ChatGPT at the time was one of the fastest ever to 100 million users. DeepSeek went even faster than that. But immediately following that, the AI companies got sued. Here are 5 cases. With comedian Sarah Silverman, writer John Grisham, the suing Stability AI and Meta. The Authors Guild sued Midjourney. Writers Guild sued OpenAI. Concord Music sued Anthropic. The legal basis for those claims is copyright infringement. Are you taking their content without their permission? That's unjust enrichment. Are they making money using the content provided by others? And also, is it possibly unfair competition? As a lark, I actually asked Stability AI's tool to create a joke in the style of Sarah Silverman, and it was pretty good, actually. It created a joke very much like hers. And I'll tell you, most of the art created here is also created with either Midjourney or DALL-E or one of the other AI tools. The immediate consequence was that almost all of those typical sources, New York Times, Reddit, Stack Overflow, Twitter, closed their APIs, shutting down access, making it harder for others to train their AI systems. Matter of fact, research at MIT, Longpre, suggested that 5% of all sources and 25% of the highest quality sources closed down their APIs. A couple of them reached deals. If you take Reddit and Stack Overflow, they reached deals, but then what immediately happened was that the moderators went dark on Reddit, and users sabotaged their answers on Stack Overflow because they weren't being compensated. It's an interesting and challenging question. Let's examine the legal issue in some sense. What happens if the plaintiffs win? That is the Sarah Silvermans and the John Grishams and the Writers Guild. Well, one, it shuts down a lot of AI and technological innovation. They're not being able to program or train their AI systems. And they have to ask the question, how in the hell are they going to negotiate with 10 million copyright owners? A huge challenge in transactions cost. Or what happens if the defendants win, the AI companies? Well, they could possibly destroy the livelihoods of, the lesser known writers or camera folks or designers. I will say, it used to be the case that I might hire designers to do some slides or things, and now with a couple of seconds, a few minutes, you can go straight to the generative AI programs and get it done. And the folks that have their content may stop sharing and close access, as we just saw with New York Times and Reddit and Stack Overflow and other cases. The typical response then would be to go open versus closed. You got proprietary and open regimes, one side or the other. And these have a lot of different advantages and costs and different advantages. I probably don't need to tell this audience, the literature on this is absolutely vast. The literature on fairness dates all the way back to Aristotle, 350 before the Common Era. More recent work is, on just governance with Ajimolu, Johnson, and Robinson. Ajimolu, of course, won the Nobel Prize. Arrow wrote on it, Besson and Maskin, Fair and Schmidt, Green and Smocher. Again, the literature on this is enormous. The benefits of proprietary, of course, are motivated innovation, and it grants the power to own or to steer or to tell what they can do with your property. We're going to come back to that when we get to the legal regimes a little bit later. But there are multiple problems with that. The first is the tragedy of the anti-commons, identified by Eisenberg and others, where if you need multiple parts, it may be very difficult to get them because you have to negotiate with all the parties. You may have missing components. You have the social waste of trying to invent around or reproduce the content. Another interesting problem is that, frankly, most ideas, in fact, simply are not patentable. Now, maybe you can get a copyright for the creation of effort, but facts are not patentable. Telephone books are not patentable. Facts are not. So this leads to, of course, the inspection paradox, right? If Rubing has a fantastic idea, he couldn't tell it to me and take it back. I could steal it. You can't simply make someone forget something that you have told them. And again, if it's not protected by patent, you can't enjoin them, or copyright, you can't enjoin them. Another, of course, is the monopoly problem. Suppose that I know that there's gold on your property. Well, I may not be motivated to inform you of that because once I've informed you, you don't need me anymore. You own the indispensable asset, which is the property, and you can just hire someone else to go dig up the gold or go competitive supply. So you've got the monopoly problem. And of course, as we just identified, how would you, in the AI case, possibly negotiate with so many owners over so many different pieces of content? On the flip side of the open regimes, where we avoid the social waste costs and we have low costs of adoption, which then facilitates adoption reuse, but it introduces the tragedy of the commons, the original, where others use the content, but they don't necessarily give back. Craig Ventnor, when he was doing research on human genome, borrowed from the public database and did not give back and was then the first to crack the code. So it's really interesting that happens. Of course, it doesn't provide resources, dollars, renminbi, or euros or anything of that sort to provide a sustainable business. It opens to a possibility of forking, and simply put, it does not motivate sharing beyond fame or altruism. Any of the profit-motivated folks simply don't share. There's a wonderful 20-year-old description. Well, hello, like someone's enjoying an evening with parent or more. There's a wonderful description of this from Shapiro and Varian's book on information rules, openness versus control, where they try to make the point that maximum protection does not equal maximum value, but we've got polar opposites in there. So on the bottom portion of the axis was what they described as industry value add. The more open you go, the greater the industry value can be as others adopt and reuse. But then if you look at your share, it's what percentage of that value do you capture? I like to decorate their chart with some live examples. Most of you, of course, are familiar with Linux. So of course, it creates enormous industry value, but it doesn't actually lead for an ability to capture much value. If you use something like the open source GNU license for Linux, The viral properties of that mean your user base immediately can redistribute your own innovations, which means you can't charge for the value of your own innovations. At the other extreme are things like the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, where folks have shut out and sued folks trying to use their technology using the provisions of that Digital Millennium Copyright Act. And then they wind up being small. They don't create large ecosystems. My argument is there probably needs to be an intermediate regime. One of the ones I'm going to propose is fairness. Perhaps we can find some intermediate space. Now, the typical way that's done in platforms is to be quasi-open, meaning you tightly control portions of it so that you can still monitor and steer, but that you open other parts for other parties to build upon. Is there an alternate? That's the topic of today's conversation, which is around fairness. If we're going to use fairness to do that, we have to be precise what we mean. So I want to be clear, we need to have precise definitions of fairness. The standard ones, according to the literature on morality and fairness, starts with there are 4 at least different definitions. The first of these is exogenous rights, such as one person, one vote. Another is fitness, or fit, giving the soccer ball to the soccer player. Another one might be need. This would be providing shelter after a natural disaster. The one I prefer to use is going to be expected marginal reward, or reward in proportion to marginal value add. For the basic version of it, consider set, S as the set of a coalition, a group of users, and you add individual I and assets of individual I. What's the value that can be created by adding the assets of that individual to the group, minus the value that the group can create without those assets or without that individual. Now, in order to make that an expectation, we really need to look at all the different ways you can use it. So we want to do, in some sense, the Shapley value. So we want to look at all of the different permutations of that. That's the binomial portion of the formula underneath, where you have n choose k. In this case, it's the number of other individuals and the number of different subsets that you can choose. And then you want to average it over all the possible different combinations. So the particular ordering doesn't matter. If you did, 3 parcels of land, it shouldn't matter whether or not you negotiated with person in the first or you negotiated the third, and they wouldn't have the holdup problem for the third person trying to extract all of the last value. So that's the Shapley value. Shapley value has great properties. All of the assets, the wealth is allocated. It treats things symmetrically. It's in the core. It's a remarkable formula. It is, however, costly. So the term on the left grows order, the number of subsets grows order 2 to the n. It also, on the term on the right, grows order n factorial. So it's expensive. It's really sometimes challenging to work with. And I'm going to grant it's also informationally difficult. If you have to value each of the individual 2 to the n subsets, you might not have that information. So I'm going to accept those criteria and see if we can deal with them a little bit later and find other ways around the complexities of that formula. But I want to use that expected marginal value as one of the ways to motivate sharing. So we're going to continue with that. Now, let's get on with the first of these main questions. The first of these, what are explanations for fairness or altruism? The first, the standard ones offered are repeated interaction or reciprocity. If you're going to engage the same folks over and over again, then you treat them well in this time and they can treat you fairly on the next one. Another one is be sisters. If you have consanguineous or blood shared genes, then the benefit to one effectively benefits the progeny or the group in other ways. Another was explicitly including in the utility function parameters such as other regarding preferences. Another one is inequality aversion. Every single one of those papers, whether it's Axelrod, Hamilton, Rabin, Farron, Schmidt, are extremely well-cited, extremely famous papers. Now, for anyone that hasn't read the paper that I've submitted, anyone have an idea? Can anyone offer an explanation based on rational self-interest alone for one-time encounter? Can anyone say why it might be the case that you would actually treat someone fairly without any of those motives, without reciprocity, without shared genes, without other regarding preferences, and without inequality aversion? Anyone want to jump in? And again, the criterion is that you haven't read the paper. If you've read the paper, I think I've tried to offer that explanation as one of the pros. Anyone want to jump in? I want to give you I'm not seeing any hands at the moment. I want to give an intuition and then show it's actually extraordinarily simple once you've had the intuition. Many of you may be familiar with the moral philosopher John Rawls, who proposes the veil of ignorance. And he proposes that a just society is one under which the decision makers make their choices behind a veil of ignorance. They have no knowledge of their own status, wealth, or capabilities. Why would that be the case? Well, imagine if you're rich, you might be selling tax policy that would favor the rich. If you're of a particular ethnic group, maybe you're making hiring decisions that would exclude out groups. If you have particular abilities, maybe you're creating opportunities in sports or other things for yourself that might not be there for others. The idea being, without knowledge of those own private advantages, you try to write neutral rules that don't hinge on those private advantages so that you would treat them fairly. Now what I want to do is I want to add the additional point. Now consider the gap between present and future as the veil of ignorance, hiding knowledge of one's own innovation contribution. Was your contribution material? Was it immaterial? Did it make a difference? Did it not matter at all to an innovation endeavor? If you don't know, then perhaps you would like a division rule on conclusion of the activity that treated people fairly. So here's the proposition, and it's dreadfully simple once you see it. Proposition is sufficiency of self-interest. In a Rawlsian ultimatum game, self-interest alone is sufficient to motivate fairness. The greater the role uncertainty, the more equal is a division rule chosen by the risk averter. For complete uncertainty, equal division rule is the unique optimum regardless of risk profile. Well, what was the ultimatum game? Of course, everyone knows it's that share the dollar where you propose what portion of a dollar or a euro you keep and what someone else gets to keep. But now the wrinkle is, you don't know if you're the prince or the pauper. You don't know if you're the one that gets to make the offer or the one that receives the offer. In that case, it's a really trivial optimization. Let's suppose that your utility is sharing a fraction X of that wealth. And now lambda refers to the likelihood that you are the decision maker or the decision receiver. In the first instance, you're going to get to keep all of it. And in the second instance, you're on the receiving end, so you get 1 minus X. The optimization, the only thing you get to choose at that point is X. Well, if you do the optimization, it's pretty straightforward. The partial derivative in the first order condition, setting them to 0, gives you the following reductive term. And then with complete uncertainty, lambda is a half. And of course, the unique optimum is the equal sharing rule. All we needed was a Rawlsian version of the ultimatum game. You don't know your own, whether or not you're the decision maker or not. And that motivates fairness completely in a single shot game without other regarding preferences of any kind. We want to use the same formula to draw a couple of other conclusions about fairness that I think are pretty interesting. So we can take that same reward property and offer a social sorting principle. The idea here is that under fair reward mechanisms, agents receiving their expected marginal contributions prefer the same ordering over their project opportunities as those chosen by an ideal social planner. The point being that you would then get increases in social wealth. So we do a simple proof there by induction. So for a set of projects, suppose there's a single agent. In that case, the agent's choices and the social planner's choices coincide. There's only a single agent there. And so, of course, the opportunities available to a single one are the ones chosen by the social planner. For the induction step, allow there to be n+1 agents in there. Now we want to consider any coalitions of groups, X or XY, offering different projects. If the marginal and total values of adding an individual to the group X exceeds that of XY, then of course the agent and social planner choices already coincide. So we've already got the condition that we need. But consider the alternative. If the marginal and total values diverge, Suppose that adding the individual to group X implies that the marginal cost is greater, but the total value of adding them to SY is greater. Then what actually happens? So the first of these is back to the agent's goal. So they're going to receive their marginal contribution. But in the second equation, we simply point out that adding I to group Y is more total value among those two projects alone, just those two projects. Well, if we then take those, we then look at the total welfare. What does the social planner do based on the total welfare? Well, if you added them that you would allocate to X, if the marginal value there plus the total value of just group SY without adding I exceeds that of group X without adding I and plus the value of adding them to group Y, that's their goal for the social planner. But now if you subtract SX and XY from both sides, we are back at the marginal contribution and the goals align again. The point being that you've now got a mechanism which simply aligns the goals of individuals in the social planner. The broader point there is you don't need a central planner. Innovation can be decentralized. In effect, what happens is, given the expectation of fair reward, individuals privately choose innovations that are socially optimal. You make much better use of innovation resources in that context. You begin to get again, each is choosing their own best opportunity. And it wasn't even hinging on the private information. If you added private information that individuals had and social planner in some sense didn't, then you might even get superior levels of innovation in there. Again, so it's just ensuring that not only are you getting higher rates of contribution, but you're also getting higher rates of innovation more broadly. There's another interesting point here about the optimality of individual choices. I want to come back to that in just a moment. Suppose that under the prospect of fair reward, could you do any better? Is there an alternate allocation better than this marginal reward property from the Shapley value that could be better? My point is, if we were to take property rights mechanisms and open source mechanisms, on average, those are going to do worse. So why would that be the case? Let's take a look at what would happen if we tried to use these principles in an optimality choice. So again, let SX be the best opportunity and let an alternate mechanism deviate from that by any amount of loss, H. Whether it's a loss or a gain, we'll come back to that. The first of these is pretty obvious. If the expected value of their marginal contribution minus the loss is less than 0, then agent I strictly prefers non-participation. They're not going to join the project. If that bias, if that loss function H, means that the expected value of their marginal contribution falls below the expected value of any other project, SY, then what happens is that agent I strictly prefers participation in her next best opportunity. So that, again, you deviate from the social optimum. Now we can flip that, of course. H could become a gain rather than a loss. But if that becomes the case, then all partners J have some reduction in theirs, so they would exit or quit the partnership for exactly the same reason as I in the first two cases. So if we deviate from that allocation, then we're going to have some other mechanism. My point is, in open source and in proprietary regimes, we have reasons not to participate. And so in this case, we've just shown examples where they're not getting their fair reward because H is effectively being withheld, and so we're not getting that optimality. Those are individual choices. So the analysis so far has examined the choice that an individual might make. If we extended the analysis to multiple parties or to two parties, we're going to touch on a very well-established theorem, but we want to view that theorem from a different angle to see if we can get a different kind of result. So consider pairwise choices of innovation. Suppose we need to transfer an asset from one party to another, okay? What we show here is just a simple visual schematic of something that many of you will recognize. I should come back to that in just a moment. So just for point of clarification here, V would be the starting value of the asset. So notice it's just at the origin, VV. So both parties agree on that. It could simply be 0. Then you want to look at what value might be created by the information of transferring the seller's asset, the idea, to the buyer. So that's delta, the expected value. The problem is that there's uncertainty that ranges larger than the range of delta. So the seller beliefs and the buyer beliefs do not converge. From the negotiations literature, we have the zone of possible agreement. That's the area in blue. And from we also have the best alternative to negotiated agreement, which is the area in red. Those calculations, again, are quite simple, very straightforward. You simply want the right triangle on the bottom as the probability of deal failure. The formula on the bottom there is really simple. The numerator is just twice the distance of the expected value range minus the delta, which is the base of the triangle. Same thing for the height of the triangle, and then of course the area of the square is the area of the square in the numerator. So it's very, very straightforward, very simple. So you can actually make probability estimates of the zone of agreement and the zone of disagreement on that. All this done is provided a visual representation of a very well-known theorem, the Myerson-Satterthwaite impossibility theorem, that given private valuations, no mechanism exists for the bilateral trade that satisfies voluntary participation, efficient allocation, when you would transfer, whatever the idea creates the increment from the buyer's perspective to the seller's perspective when the buyer believes that it's more, happens to believe more, it's more valuable, and include budget balance. The reason for that is given private beliefs over the future value of that particular asset, each side has incentive to misrepresent its own position. And so if you want to motivate disclosure, you might need to reward them, which then violates budget balance. Or if you don't have that, then you don't get voluntary participation. But consider the veil of ignorance again, and consider the information nature of the asset. Consider what happens if we treat this as a fair reward problem with a slight twist on the procedural fairness to actually make it happen. How could you sidestep the Myerson-Satterthwaite impossibility theorem? Well, first of all, the private valuations over what that increment is worth ex ante can become market valuations of that value increment ex post. That resolves the strategic incentive to misrepresent the actual value, because you're no longer ex post, relying on private information. It's the market value of that information. The market's realized innovation value greater than zero can be split via my Nash bargaining solution, again, simply the Shapley value, avoiding the subsidy, which resolves the budget balance. And of course, because this is an information asset, it remains available to the source. It's shared but not transferred, and it's not public domain, which resolves the voluntary participation aspect of it. So while multi-party deal failure might normally happen because you couldn't transfer or come to an agreement, in this case, we're looking to procedural fairness between now and future at a point in time when markets could assess. You simply need the expectation of the value being greater than zero, again, under a commitment to that fair process as a way of sidestepping that rather interesting and challenging impossibility theorem. So let's take one further step. What about social interest in fairness? Suppose that innovation has already occurred and one of the inventors seizes all the gains from the endeavor. So they've treated their partners unfairly. Why should a social planner ever care about that? Because that's a transfer payment. At that point, the innovation has already occurred, so the sum total welfare must be the same. I'm going to return to that formula that I just gave you a moment ago, and it's actually quite simple. So if we borrow the insight from Axelrod, well, why would you forbear in the first place? Well, if you seized all of the gains of that increment between yourself and a partner, so that's 1 and 2, that's the delta on the left. If that's less than the net present value of your foregone opportunities, because having cheated people, others won't deal with you, then you would forbear and you wouldn't cheat the partner. The formula there is quite simple. It's on the far right are the deals that you might get with other partners, J, other than the current, above 2, so 3 up to n. Then there's the expectation of that value, which is the probability that you could reach agreement. Of course, delta then discounts it to the present. So that's really simple boundary condition on that. Notice, by the way, it's very straightforward. It simply means you're unlikely to cheat if you're patient, if there's higher agreement, or if there's higher innovation value on the back end. You're more likely to cheat if there's higher innovation value on the front end. If there's suddenly $1 billion, maybe you're going to go ahead and do it. You just don't have enough discount factor to worry for the others. But that, of course, is an interesting challenge. That's only your own incentives. If it's the case that we are in a social structure where cheating is rampant, if you cheat one, what that means is that people who can envision themselves in the same position as the party that got cheated, they might forego similar opportunities because they too don't want to be cheated. Then what we're doing is we're summing over the opportunity costs, the foregone innovation value of other projects that are not undertaken. So in that case, we're not just summing over the value of the individual, we're summing over the third-party values in there. The point being more broadly, again, it's just simply trying to make precise a kind of social intuition that cheating one cheats us all. And this is completely consistent with the Ajimolu, Robinson, and Johnson work on just governance. If there's just governance that avoids cheating, you're more likely to get folks participating, which is then consistent with more of that wealth maximization. So I want to come back to how do we make it work? Kind of its fun theory, but we got some interesting challenges. We get a interesting problem if different people have different views on what's fair. The Shapley value itself, as I pointed out earlier, is quite problematic. The reason it's problematic, of course, is again that the computational costs are extraordinarily high, growing again 2 to n and n factorial. It also may be informationally impossible. Given the 2 to the n possible subsets, you may not have the values of all the individual subsets from which then to calculate what's actually fair. So how do we solve that problem and make it practical in a real sense? I see, hold on, I see. All right. I want to offer an alternative. One way to do that is to set a different set of boundary conditions, and we're going to just replay the intuitions in a different form. What I want to offer you is a novel criterion, which I'm going to call sufficient fairness. What are the properties of sufficient fairness? The first property is that ex ante, before going into the deal, the prospect of fairness is great enough to motivate original sources to share their ideas. Why? Because if they don't share their ideas, then you don't have them. The second one is to pick up on the illustration that we just showed you. Suppose that ex post, the next criterion, is it the case that the realized fairness is great enough? It doesn't have to be perfect, but it's just good enough to motivate analogous third parties to have chosen to share from the beginning. Okay, so it's going backwards. It's now asking, again, in some sense, behind that veil of ignorance, would a third party now be willing to share their asset in the same position, knowing what the ultimate result happened to be? I want to give you a thought experiment to show why these are important and why these mechanisms matter. Suppose that either one is violated, all right? Consider the contradiction implied by any mechanism that violates either criterion. On project start, if any party is motivated to withhold information, some innovation potentially is blocked. On project conclusion, if any analogous party is motivated to withhold information on subsequent projects, some innovation is likewise blocked. That means that an inferior mechanism violates either criterion. There's an optimal mechanism must have both, right? You need those properties. We can extend that, and if we look at what we talked about at the beginning of the talk, the presentation, and we looked at, well, what are the regimes that we're using presently? Well, the property rights mechanism doesn't have those properties. The property rights mechanism fails these criteria due to the inspection paradox. That's the case where it doesn't rise to the level of intellectual property. So you withhold the idea because you can't take it back. It doesn't solve that first problem because of the monopsony problem. That's the case of the gold on your property, and the person who knows it may not tell you because you don't need them. And it doesn't solve that property because of the AI case that we visited at the very beginning. The motivating example with Gen AI companies, the transactions costs on numerous small contributions are simply too great compared to the actual value. So property rights don't share those issues. Likewise, open source fails those criteria. Folks that are motivated to share for profit reasons don't share under the open source regime. So neither of those two things actually manages or meets the test of sufficient fairness. I want to simply point out that some of the things that are most valuable about sufficient fairness are that it really does help to address a lot of those same problems. So first off, it avoids the problem of having to satisfy disgruntled inventors who overvalue their contributions. I don't know how many of you have spoken with entrepreneurs, but if you asked 3 different folks what their proportional contribution was to a successful startup, contributions are probably going to total like 250%, not 100%. So you have to find some way of breaking that logjam. The second is that it operationalizes Rawls' insight. How do we make it real? You need some kind of a mechanism that addresses both of those criteria. It also allows the specific choice of mechanism to be culturally agnostic. It could differ in, under Sharia, Hinduism, Eastern, Western. It just doesn't matter. It avoids differences in private valuations. And most importantly, it avoids some of the information and computational costs of valuing all the 2n subsets in n factorial permutations to get exact fairness. You don't need exact fairness in order to get the results, the innovation benefits. What you need is these newly proposed criteria of sufficient fairness. So where does that bring us to where we are in the law? What are we currently doing? The typical ways to handle this in the law are property regimes and liability regimes. Under a property regime, you own the property and you have to negotiate. Under a liability regime, you don't have to negotiate, but you're responsible for benefits or damages. Let me see if I can illustrate with a classic logic from some seminal papers on legal regimes and property rights versus liability regimes. So suppose you want to drive someone else's car or you want to use their car. Then in the first instance, that's a property rule, right? The property confers great power. You can enjoin all uses. And if someone wants to buy it from you, you don't have to sell it, even accounting for your subjective value. Maybe it's your grandfather's classic car and it has sentimental value. Well, the only way someone else could take it from you would be to pay you, and it would even account for that sentimental value. So it even accounts for subjective value. But now consider the alternative. Suppose that you want to drive on the road. Suppose that you had to negotiate with every other driver on the road. In that case, the permission required, the transactions cost would kill you. It would be impossible to negotiate with every other single driver. So no one else can enjoin your use of your own car on the road. The way we handle that, of course, is if you then do damage to someone else's car, you are liable. But you're liable at market value, not subjective value. So it doesn't matter what they misrepresent, whether they represent, what their subjective value, whether it's grandpa's car or not. It's only the replacement value or the market value. More precisely, if we look at them again, the way it's articulated, this goes back to famous papers by Ron Coase. Again, the original source of this is kind of his article is the problem of social cost, and here I'm discussing the problem of social gain. And then Melamed and Calabresi adapt this specifically to property versus liability rules. So in the first instance, where the transactions costs are relatively small relative to the adjudication or assessment costs, we use property rights. But in the second case, where there's heavy transactions cost, you had to negotiate with every other driver on the road, and the assessment costs for market value are light. Here, we have very standard processes for a bent fender or a broken headlight or structural damage. That can be done basically with a couple of photographs, and they're very simple industries to do it. You don't need a lot of adjudication. Then you use liability rules. So I want to add further insight. Under the original Coase and Melamed insight, if negotiation costs are high, we assign liability to the low-cost avoider. This is the person driving the car, and if they drive better, they're less likely to have an accident. You don't assign liability to the other driver. You assign it due to the party, who in effect causes the damage. But that's negative externality. Suppose we are now talking about intellectual property innovation. That is a positive externality. So the insight that I want to offer to you in fair regimes, if negotiation costs are high, assign liability to the low-cost producer. You don't have to negotiate. You can use it, but then you're responsible for the upside. You have to share it with the parties that provided the original assets in this. So if we go back to the original argument, I want to take this even a step further, okay? So that was the original one. So, so under Coase and Melamed and Calabrese, if negotiation costs are low, we use property rights. So guessing doesn't matter because trade will be efficient. And if negotiation costs are high, we assign liability to low-cost avoider in the cases of negative externalities. So then we want to add, if negotiation costs are high, we assign liability to the low-cost producer in the case of the positive externalities. Finally, we also need to add the opportunity cost. What are the costs of foregone innovation? If the opportunity costs are high, likewise, we want to assign liability to the low-cost producer in the case of the positive externalities. What does this mean if we go back to the GenAI cases? What that would imply is that they would have the ability to move forward to produce the new assets, to invest in new technology, but that they would not owe a sufficient fairness, ideally the Shapley value to the different sources of information, to the expected value, but a sufficient fairness version all the way around. It solves the problems of holdup, and it solves the problem of being able to create progress in forward institutions. So what are the arguments in favor of liability rules for recombinant information? Well, the most straightforward is the marginal value of most remixes for generative AI training, YouTube videos, Kaggle data is modest. It's really small. The negotiation costs of each individual remix typically exceed the value that might be created, yet it rarely exceeds the value of all possible use cases. So we solve the holdup problem. Legal arguments have focused on transactions costs and adjudication costs, but for the most part, they have overlooked opportunity costs, i.e. innovation that has not occurred in there. So that, again, would also favor the liability rules under legal regime. Under the property rule, information that feeds downstream innovation exhibits the monopsony and inspection paradox problems. And in the open source rules, folks don't contribute for the reason that any of the profit-motivated folks don't work. Also, a very straightforward statistical fact. Lots of variation and lots of different inputs is exactly what's needed to estimate the marginal value of fair contribution. So if folks are allowed to proceed and you're allowed to gather some of that market value, that's the kind of thing that we would need in action to do the reverse allocation back to the original sources. Another interesting thing goes to the question then of governance. Because you're doing orchestration, large-scale orchestration of small-scale externalities, you might want some form of platform governance. That brings us back to having successful business platforms to operate some of these IP regimes in order to enforce repayment on the innovation sources. You need someone to actually make that happen. You can't simply rely on the parties that did the taking to actually do the giving. So we have to actually handle that problem as well. So we may need an intermediary again for the recombinant innovation on large-scale aggregation of small-scale externalities. So in the context of this recombinant information, I have a couple of different claims. The first of these was that rational self-interest alone is sufficient to justify fairness in a single encounter. There is no need for reciprocity, shared genes, repeated play, or altruism in any kind. We simply use the Rawlsian veil of ignorance to understand the gap between present and future and understand that it is entirely possible that you might want to design a mechanism that would achieve fairness. The second is that fairness increases the rate of innovation, and it does so in two ways. The first is to ensure that sources will contribute their information to a project so the option on innovation is possible. The second is that individuals choose for themselves those marginal opportunities they're the same as those of the social planner. So you can decentralize to the best opportunities. So again, we get two benefits. One of these is the sharing, and the second is the sort ordering. And it seems as though that hopefully would make more successful innovation. We have to make these things practical. So the Shapley value is extremely hard to estimate. And also people have different valuations on fairness. But we can avoid that. We don't have to estimate the value of all Toolean combinations and n factorial permutations. We use those criteria of sufficient fairness, which enumerate, on the first hand, individuals have to believe they'll be treated fairly, so they share the information. And in the second hand, ex post, behind the veil of ignorance, would others have made the same choice? In both cases, then, you capture the information necessary to create the option on innovation. And lastly, that implies liability rather than property rules. They can be more conducive to innovation based on information reuse and combination. And interestingly enough, they can motivate a platform business model. So with that, we've got about 10 minutes for questions. So I'm very happy to pause and see any questions or any other thoughts on how you might want to handle this question of innovation, fairness, and property rights, especially in this age of generative AI.
Actually, I have maybe two questions. The first one is, it seems that we're assuming like the pure will of ignorance, or in other words, we're assuming the uncertainty for future role symmetric for each agent or each party here. So I wonder, what if the future role uncertainty is asymmetric? For example, the current dominant player who has upper hand in the current bargaining, they may be more confident that in the future they are very likely to also be the dominant player, to still have the bargaining power. So just like the leading company like OpenAI now, right?
So you're quite correct. So if you were to go back to that, if your confidence, so your certainty is not one half. If you're confident of being, the leader in the ultimatum game, then absolutely you're going to choose you tend to choose an unfair division rule. Even in these equations yourself, if lambda equals 1, then you're going to choose the boundary condition, and you're going to keep as much as possible in that. So that's absolutely true. So in some ways, you need the intellectual exercise to make that happen. If folks do know their attributes and they're highly confident of which role they're playing, then we're back at the standard condition, and you might need an intermediary to enforce that mechanism. But then you still do have the question of, what about third parties? Even if you're confident of your own contribution, we happen to know that the majority of entrepreneurial startups don't succeed. Are there other resources, are there other opportunities that you might be missing? In some ways, the question is, you don't know what you don't know. So is there perhaps a better opportunity? Because you're going to claim too much of it. Are you missing partners that might otherwise contribute that would make it even more valuable? Again, that's that bias property that I showed you earlier. And was that this one? It was this one, right? If you're overclaiming, then are you losing partners? Folks choosing their next best opportunity would be a possible response to that.
Okay. Another second question is, it seems for the automatic game here, we are using a single period model, right? So we don't think about repeated interaction yet. So would a dynamic model rather than a static one, or just maybe a repeated one, be different from the single period one? For example, for innovation, repeated investment usually is important because the horizon or the timeline you consider is very long, right? So I wonder whether the situation will be more complex.
Well, if you're quite correct in that. So if we were to go back to, any of the repeated games, then you're much more likely to treat folks well in repeated interaction. I mean, for agency theory, they're quite well established that you can get reciprocity in repeated games. So if you extend the time horizon and repeat the interactions, you may be able to get better cooperation. and better fairness out of the deal. Again, the point here was really to show that even in these cases missed by other parts of the literature, it's possible to motivate based on pure self-interest alone if uncertainty is high enough between present and future. So that was a piece of the added insight that had not been articulated previously.
Yeah, got it. Thanks.
Hi, Marshall. I have a question, and it's a very philosophical and talk, and thank you very much. So I think you mentioned initially a four definitions of fairness, and then you proposed the sufficient fairness. Yeah, exactly here. Yeah, you proposed the efficient kind of fairness as a kind of alternative measure. So if I understand correctly, all these definitions boil down to a kind of a way of thinking about aggregate welfare, so social welfare, how you think about evaluate different people's welfare. So when you propose the alternative measure of the sufficient fairness, so implicitly you also assume something there, right? You assume kind of you value two things, ex ante, ex post. So I think the question is here, so if we push one step further, so what's exactly the rationale to choose a fairness rule? So why should we care about these two things in the first place? So think about it. You motivate the people to share in the first place, and you expose the third party or these kind of things. So I think it's somehow implicitly we put innovation at a very high priority in the first place. So it's like behind all these five rules, these four rules here, and in the proposed rule, so we implicitly assume something which is important. It's of very high value to the society. That's why we think about that's the most important. I think this is kind of, I can ask this question further. So what's really something we try to maximize? So what's exactly it's more like here the fairness is a rule of defining aggregating social welfare. So I think among these five rules, if we choose one rule, it's something kind of aggregate among these five rules, something kind of a question deeper, I think. So that's a kind of very philosophical question. I want to hear your thoughts on this.
So that's a fun question. I appreciate that question. So I'll come back to this particular slide. But let me go through it in terms of just the basic concept. So what was sufficient fairness? The idea behind sufficient fairness is the criterion actually isn't fairness. The criterion is, are folks willing to contribute their ideas in order that an innovative endeavor is possible? So those are the criteria that we need. What I'm concerned about is that folks don't contribute because they particularly believe that they are not treated fairly. And as we showed, I think it was in this one, if there's any bias, there's a risk that they either defect, so they don't share, or they defect to a different project. My point is, if you use sufficient fairness, then it's possible for these other attributes to enter into, suppose that their utility function happens to include need or fit or exogenous rights. The point is that if that's true, you can deviate up to an amount H, which still preserves this property. So even if you're deviating, they're still going to contribute because they're not valuing exact fairness. Maybe it's a moral issue, maybe it's risk aversion, maybe it's inequality aversion. If you can still deviate up to the point when they still choose to participate. So the criterion isn't fairness per se, it's enough fairness that they don't deviate. So you can weight any number of different factors and still be within that window. That's, I think, the better way to think about that problem. You can add whatever factors you want, just don't deviate outside that window.
I see. Thank you. Yeah.
Hi, Marshall.
Yes.
I also have a quick question about, you mentioned that people, they may, have different views on fairness, right? So people are concerned they are not being treated fairly. And I think a deeper, probably even more fundamental issue or question is that people's subjective assessment of the value of their ideas or information or the content they create. So if I consider myself as an idea creator or content generator, I may intrinsically exaggerate value. I think it worth this much. And so hence, I don't think I'm being treated fairly. And that's purely subjective, right?
Yes.
So it's basically really, really complicated. How do you actually, allocate a fair allocation of the value? I mean, it has to come down to some sort of subjective. There will be some subjective conflict or something, like, or you have to assign a objective market value somehow.
So that's exactly the issue. So you in some ways you've hit on the prospective answer to that very fine question, which is you may be debating beforehand what you think the value is worth, but if you then place the innovation, you've placed the idea in the marketplace, and no one uses it, or they use it extensively, you will have gathered the information necessary to calculate that market value as opposed to the subjective value. What we need is, in effect, that other willingness to pay from third parties to help establish what that is. Each of us, there is a tendency among all of us, to overvalue our initial contributions, to overvalue our portion of it. That again is why entrepreneurs, if you sum their beliefs over their individual contributions, it sums to more than 100%. But one needs to suspend that belief long enough in order to gather the information to establish the market value as opposed to the subjective value, from which the Nash bargaining solution or the fair value can effectively be determined. So there is an informational problem, a period over which you'd have to gather further information. I will pose another question to the audience. This is something that I'd be interested in testing. So I don't know if folks have access to any information marketplaces or information platforms, but I think it'd be very interesting to try to offer the different regimes and see if we could actually measure and empirically test and challenge the rates of innovation under different IP regimes. I think I've actually got some studies designed to do that. So if there are those that are interested in trying to make that happen, I think it'd be quite exciting to try to follow up and test the different IP regimes to see if we could get different results.
Right. So speaking about I think you mentioned something about the different IP regimes. But speaking about how to quantify the marginal value of contribution, say the marginal value of data contribution in terms of training large language models, right? And that connects to how to quantify the Shapley value, something like that. And that itself is a challenge, I guess.
I agree. That is quite challenging to see if we could actually figure out how do the models perform if you withhold certain information as compared to providing that information. Can you actually do that in clumps? I mean, one of the nice things about the Shapley value is that it's additively separable. So you can withhold blocks of information to see if you can actually get differences, and then you can subdivide blocks to see what kinds of differences you get among those. That additive separability, hopefully, will give you some traction in trying to help to determine some of those values across various combinations.
Yeah, thanks. Especially, I've heard from some experts saying that may not be the energy or the computational power or algorithms. Maybe the bottleneck for the AI development would just be the domain knowledge, those non-public knowledge, non-public information, and how to incentivize people to contribute those like private information to train the AI models may be very important topic. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
I guess increasingly challenging problem.
Yeah. So is there any other questions for the audience? If not, we are just right on time, and maybe we'll call the end of today here. And thanks again for Marshall and everyone who come today. And see you guys soon, probably in 2 weeks.